Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you on the first day of Tata Literature Live 2022 in association with the NCPA, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Titan, powered by Godrej and Kotak. This session is sponsored by Kotak. Thank you for tuning in on to the first day of the online edit of the 13th annual Mumbai International Literature Festival you're so fond of. This year, in its special combined format, we have 2 days of the online version of the festival, that's today and tomorrow. And then for those in and around Mumbai, remember you can join us for the offline version, that is the physical edit of the festival at NCPA on Friday, November 11th, Saturday 12th, and Sunday, November 13th, and at the St. Paul's Institute and the Tidal Waves bookstore, both in Bandra, on Saturday and Sunday. So remember to log on to tatalitlive.in to check out the schedule of sessions and speakers, and looking forward to seeing you all there because I will be there. Now, on to our third online session of today. In his essay, Rooms in the House of Stone, Michael Doris says, here are two facts that should not both be true. One, there is sufficient food produced in the world every year to feed every human being on the planet. And two, nearly 800 million people literally go hungry every day, with more than a third of the Earth's population, 2 billion men and women, malnourished one way or another, according to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. How can this be? And yet, in an ever-fragile world distraught by the havoc of climate destruction, how do we make food more efficiently and in ecologically sound ways? Taking this discussion further today, let me introduce our speakers. He is a British journalist and essayist, author of several books on environmental issues, and a regular columnist in The Guardian. He started off by working in a radio program for the BBC Natural History Unit on the environment, and later as a journalist in the BBC International Unit. He's written many best-selling books and has co-written the concept album, Breaking the Spell of Loneliness, the maker of many a viral video, including one that he co-presented with Greta Thunberg that has been watched over 50 million times. His latest book, Regenesis, Feeding the World Without Devouring the Planet, was published this year. Please welcome Mr. George Monbiot. He will be in conversation with aptly named Bahar Dutt, an environmental journalist and a conservation biologist. She's been a past environmental editor for CNN News 18, a columnist with Mint, having won 12 awards for reporting. She now teaches media and climate change to undergraduates. Remember to contribute your questions for the Q&A at the end of this talk by writing into us in the comment boxes of the platform you're viewing us on at any time through the session. And do remember to write in your names as well. So come on, let's grab a bite of sustainable appetite with Mr. Monbiot and Miss Bahar Dutt. Over to you, speakers.
One of the most prolific, and I must add, sincere voices for the planet today. Joining me from the United Kingdom is George Monbiot. Welcome to the Tata Literature Live Festival. George, congratulations on your new book, Regenesis, Feeding the World Without Devouring the Planet. Well, I've spent the last few days devouring your book. And as you make it quite clear that our current food production system is destroying the planet. And you start, in fact, with the following words, if I may quote from your book. I've explored woodlands and rainforests, savannas and grasslands, rivers, ponds, marshes, mountaintops, coastlines, and shallow seas. But I have never explored deliberately and thoroughly the ground beneath my feet, end quote. So George, describe to us this journey, if I must say, which started from digging the soil on your farm to this book that calls for an end to farming as we know today.
Thank you, Bahar. Well, soil is something I started deliberately then to engage with, having neglected it for so long. And as I began working through it, first with a lens and then with a library, and began to explore this extraordinary ecosystem beneath our feet, which turns out to be a biological structure, like a coral reef, and is as diverse and abundant as any coral reef or rainforest, and is absolutely crammed with an extraordinary array of life on which the soil itself depends. I began to see it as perhaps the most fascinating of all ecosystems, but also to realize that the way I'd been neglecting it reflects the way that society has been neglecting it, and that our ignorance and lack of engagement with the soil and our profound lack of understanding even of what it is one of the things that's accelerating our path towards, well, planetary ruin. And that, alongside much of the thinking I'd been doing about food and farming over many years, prompted me to really start a massive rethink. What I realized was that we have been very effective in talking about fossil fuel industry, about the chemicals industry, about the plastic industry, about various other industries which are also causing enormous harm, but extremely reluctant to discuss the biggest cause of harm of all, which is farming. That, above all other factors, is driving the collapse of Earth systems. It's by far away the biggest cause of habitat destruction, of wildlife loss, of species extinction, of soil degradation, of freshwater use, and indeed, most importantly, perhaps, of land use. And land use, I think, should be considered the preeminent environmental issue, because every hectare we use for our own purposes is a hectare of land that cannot support wild ecosystems, such as rainforests and savannas and wetlands, mangroves, all the rest of it. And so by sprawling across vast areas of the planet, in order to produce food, often at very low yields, so very extensive farming is actually at least as damaging as intensive farming. We have done more than anything else to push Earth systems towards their tipping points. So I began to see that, you know, we should break that ring of power that surrounds the farming industry, which doesn't permit us to discuss it in the same terms that we discuss other industries, to recognize that, yes, we are dependent upon farming for our survival, but that doesn't mean that we should turn a blind eye to the impacts it has, or not try with great effort to reduce those impacts and ensure to the greatest extent possible that we can feed the world without devouring the planet.
Feed the world without devouring the planet. And that brings me actually, it links very nicely to my next question, which is that you speak about the global standard diet, which creates the global standard farm, which is based on identical techniques used by farmers across the world, making them dependent on the same battery of chemicals, the same technology. But here I'm going to take the critic's voice, and they would say to you that you're seeing it from the lens of an ecologist. And many would say that you're speaking from a place of privilege, and that, for instance, you do make a mention of the Green Revolution. Many would say that we had to intensify crop farming. We had to use those chemicals because we had to feed many people, thousands and millions of people. So what would you say to those critics who would say that you speak from a place of privilege?
Well, it's the exact opposite. I mean, at no point do I call for less food production. In fact, what I'm pushing for throughout is high yields. And in fact, I see many other environmentalists fetishizing low yield production, which means agricultural sprawl, which first of all means that people won't be fed, but it also means that we use an awful lot of the planet in not feeding people. And one of the things I'm calling for perpetually is to focus on the numbers, not the pictures. You know, that we see an elite discourse about food, which is all about pictures. Look at this beautiful pastoral scene. Look at this lovely plate of food I've got. Everyone should eat like this, with no recognition of whether that's possible, whether it's possible to scale those elite diets. And it actually is not possible to scale those elite diets. You know, the question of how will 8 billion people be fed is one that scarcely features in the popular press. It's the most extraordinary thing. It's this huge blind spot. It's just like, look at me with my lovely diet. Everybody should have the same diet. And in many cases, that's completely impossible. So a classic example is the Western fetish around pasture-fed meat, with all these celebrity chefs and food writers saying you should be eating pasture-fed meat. Well, if everybody ate pasture-fed meat, we would need several planets because of the huge land requirement it has. Yes. And there would be no space at all for wild ecosystems, let alone for human beings. And our food needs could simply not be met. There was one study in the United States comparing corn-fed beef to pasture-fed beef. Now, corn-fed beef is destructive enough. I mean, it's a devastating business because a huge amount of food is required to feed those cattle, which are then used to feed human beings. But corn-fed beef, by comparison to pasture-fed beef, is quite environmentally benign, because if you were to switch to pasture-fed beef, you would need to increase the area required to raise those cattle by 270%. Which means you would have to fell all the forests in the United States, water all the deserts, de-gazette the national parks, demolish the cities, and you would still be importing most of your meat from the Amazon. Yes. So I'm trying to do the opposite, but what I'm calling for here is not just replicating the Green Revolution. Yes. You know, because but I totally recognize that, you know, without those very high yielding techniques, we simply would not be able to feed everyone. Yes. But to pursue a new model of farming, which seeks to sustain high yields, but with much lower impacts. So what I'm looking for everywhere, that's the holy grail, is high yield, low impact. Yes. Sorry to interrupt you there, but you actually touched on something which I observed about the book, and which, according to me, is the point where the book reaches a crescendo. And that's the point where you take on the wicked problems with the wicked solutions. Because you're not saying, okay, let's stop chemical-based farming and let's all go. I mean, I think you're going deeper than that. And you take on the conundrums. I think environmental problems don't have any one solution. And you take on the conundrums that anybody growing food, and you know, for us as consumers who are eating that food and who want to, you know, consume food which has less of a carbon footprint. So I think that's where I found the strength of the book, that you took on those contradictions. So walk us through one or two of these conundrums you faced. And especially, again, what I found delightful was where you go to what we call the maverick farmers, because you find a farmer who's doing no-till farming, but he has to use weedicides. Then you find a farmer who's you know, practicing agroecology, but there are some contradictions there as well. So walk us through some of those contradictions. Thank you. So I think a sort of fundamental contradiction is that a lot of what we fetishize as good farming is very low yield. So the agroecologist I went to see, who's famous in this country for doing everything right, within the borders of his farm, everything is right. He's not using pesticides, he's not using herbicides, he's not even using fertilizer, because he's using a rotation instead. And he's using old varieties of wheat, which might be slightly better nutritionally than the modern varieties, though the jury's still out on that. It's not nearly as clear as some people maintain. And there's almost no inputs at all to his farm, apart from seed. That's pretty well the only thing he buys in. And now he's even growing his own seed on the farm. And so people, literally thousands of people visit every year and say, oh, this is how farms should be. But his yields are so low that the wheat he's growing looks more like meat in terms of land use. It's more like what the amount of land required to raise the same weight of chicken as the wheat that he's growing. So if everyone were to do that, the farming would need to occupy an even greater portion of the world's surface than it does already. Right. And And so we then have the phenomenon of agricultural sprawl. Now, we all hate urban sprawl, and rightly so, because urban sprawl is damaging for cities and for the countryside. But the entire urban area of the planet, all the homes, the businesses, the infrastructure is 1% of the planet's land surface. Farming is 38% of the planet's land surface. And most of that is taken up by low yield farming of the kind that my friend, the agroecologist, practices, but primarily through pasture-fed animals. And there's pretty well no extra land that you can safely take for farming. I mean, already farming is pushing into some of the most biodiverse and carbon-rich habitats on Earth and destroying those, massively contributing to ecological and climate collapse, which we're seeing in the Amazon, we're seeing in Southeast Asia, we're seeing in Madagascar, we're seeing in so many of the world's richest ecosystems. It's being destroyed primarily by cattle ranching. That's by far and away the biggest cause. But also, you're either going into forests or protected areas, but really the rest of the land surface is desert, mountains and ice, so you can't farm there anyway. So it's pretty well occupying all the land it can occupy, and in fact it would do the planet a massive favor if we removed agriculture from as much of that land as we can, which is why yields should be high while impact should be low. So in pursuing this holy grail of high yields, low impact, I found that there are not many people who are achieving that. There's one remarkable grower of fruit and vegetables I've spent time with, who is managing to maintain high yields without either fertilizer or manure. And he's doing that by through mediating the relationship between plants and bacteria and fungi in the soil in a really fascinating way. I'm also very interested in the potential of perennial grain crops. And one of those has now been fully commercialized. It's a variety of rice, which is now being grown in southern China, where it has been harvested now year after year and maintains the same yields as rice, which is planted in one year, dies in that same year, has to be replanted the next year. And the great thing about perennial crops is that you don't have to plow and start again every year, or spray and start again every year. So you greatly reduce the damage to the soil, you greatly reduce the establishment costs of a new crop in terms of pesticides, herbicides, fertilizer, irrigation, and you greatly reduce the labor demand as well. The organizations like the Land Institute in the United States are hoping to develop a whole series of these perennial, i.e. long-lasting crops, wheat and sunflowers and legumes and all sorts. And if they succeed, as they have succeeded with that rice variety, then we could really begin to see on a large scale those high yields being maintained while the impacts are much, much lower.
All right, impacts are much lower, high yielding varieties. I can't help but turn the discussion actually to India. And I must give you a classic example. You're probably aware of it already. I know you mentioned zero budget natural farming, which has been practiced in Andhra Pradesh. It's been well documented. But I'd like to give you another example of Punjab, where farmers are locked into and Punjab was where the Green Revolution happened, but farmers are locked into this cycle of growing wheat and paddy. And because the high yielding varieties were introduced by the government, the subsidies are given there. And because there's such a small gap between the sowing and harvesting of both the crops, the farmers are forced to burn the stubble that remains on the farm, which in turn causes air pollution. And while I think that it fits very well with that paradigm you were talking about how farming is destroying the planet, farmers in Punjab say, but we are the rice bowl for the country. So what are the solutions then? What do we say to them? Would you say that what you're suggesting in your book can be applicable to the developing world and India in particular?
Well, very much so. And in fact, I looked specifically at this issue. The subsidies for wheat and rice have helped to lock farmers into this duopoly of crops, which have definitely served India well and served those farmers well and fed a very large number of people. But there is enormous damage involved in just sticking with those two crops. And as you say, there's that very quick turnover time, which requires not only the burning of the crop residues, but also repeated deep ploughing of the paddy land in order to prepare it for wheat. Because you need to turn from being an anaerobic soil to an aerated soil, and that requires a great deal of ploughing, which contributes to much faster soil erosion and could lead to dust bowls in one of the most fertile places on earth, which would be a total catastrophe. So one answer is to change the subsidy system. Actually, we need to do that worldwide, because almost all the subsidies we pay are perverse in one way or another. And in this respect, you would subsidize farmers to grow crops other than just paddy and wheat. And there's lots of potential. I mean, Punjab has got such enormous agricultural potential. You can grow a huge variety of crops. Of course, what that also requires is you need to introduce people to the crops and show that there's benefits in eating these crops too. And that's partly on price, but partly on the real necessity, I think, to diversify our diets for our health as well as for the health of the living planet. But also, given the enormous costs involved, the enormous ecological costs, both the burning and the ploughing, it's really worth investigating whether new approaches such as perennial grain crops could actually be beneficial. Maybe there are crops which you could harvest in both seasons, keeping the same crop in the ground, a perennial crop, which then lasts from year to year, and you can keep harvesting it. I mean, a lot of this currently is quite speculative, but there have to be better ways than the way we're doing it at the moment, because the great danger is, and I keep coming back to this with a huge amount of research in the book, is that the ways in which we sustain our food system today severely compromise our food system in the future.
Yes. And it's also linked to our diets, because building on what you just said, in fact, now the tendency in India, what is being advocated is a millet-based diet, and perhaps giving incentives to farmers in Punjab to also grow millets. And so then the market ties in nicely with policy change. What I found, again, delightful about the book is that as environmentalists, we tend to get obsessed with the problem and we don't offer solutions. And I noticed that you do offer those solutions. But just imagine a politician walking into the room who doesn't perhaps have the time to go through the 500 pages in your book. What are the 3 top policy changes you would advocate? Imagine if Britain's agricultural minister has just walked into the room and he or she is listening to us. What would you say to them?
Well, the first is to invest massively in research and development on soil science, because so much of the damage we do is out of ignorance. We just don't know what's going on under the ground. And so we subsoil plow when we shouldn't be doing that. We irrigate when we don't need to be. We over-fertilize. We do all these interventions which are damaging and lose money for farmers, and often completely unnecessary. And I've become heavily involved with some soil scientists in trying to find new ways of discovering what's happening in the soil and to minimize those interventions. And I think if we understood much more about the soil, then we could greatly reduce impacts while maintaining our high yields. And then we'd have a much better chance of being able to grow food in the future, because the soil would still be there. But that requires a lot of money, and governments should be putting research money into a much better understanding. I mean, we're spending billions of dollars on the Mars rover program to discover what's going on the surface of that planet. How about spending billions of dollars to discover what's going on the surface of our planet? It seems crazy that we're not spending that money here, but we are spending it on Mars. And so that would be number one.
Okay.
Number two would be to encourage a shift of high protein food production off the land and into the factory. And I know that sounds really shocking. And people say, oh, I don't want to eat food out of a factory. Well, for a start, almost all the food we eat has passed through a factory at one point or another. But I'm addressing here specifically the high protein food. So particularly animal products and crops such as soy and palm oil and coconut, which are also very damaging when grown on a large scale. And
so can I just ask you there, I'm sorry to interrupt, but are you advocating that it should be the end of animal farming and we should have prototypes for meat, alternatives to meat? Is that what you're advocating?
On the broad scale, yes. I mean, I'm not saying that, you know, subsistence farmers with a couple of cows or a couple of pigs should not be able to do what they're doing anymore. But, you know, when we're talking about global dietary shift, we should be shifting away from eating the flesh and secretions of animals, because it's just got this enormous cost to the planet, and also, of course, an enormous cost to the animals. We're slaughtering 76 billion animals a year to feed ourselves. And India has always been a world leader in not eating meat and indeed, you know, eating far fewer animal products.
But the data on that is changing now, I must add.
I know it is,
and more and more Indians are eating meat. And so I don't know about that. And I'm not even sure if as a communications policy that will work to tell people, here's what you should eat and what you should not eat.
No, so I'm not relying on moral suasion. I'm absolutely not relying on moral suasion. What I'm very interested in is the potential for new products to displace the old ones and to compete on price, but also on health as well as on environmental benefits. And there's, I think, a massive food revolution coming. We have this technology called precision fermentation, which is really just a refined form of brewing. It was developed by NASA in the 1960s. It's just really a way of doing fermentation in a slightly more accurate and precise way than we've done it before. And there's several companies now competing in this field, growing bacteria, microorganisms, on hydrogen in some cases, methanol in other cases, or in other words, not with any farmed products at all. But with products made from solar power in the best cases, and this gives us this tremendous potential, radically to shrink the footprint of food production in terms of our land use, our water use, and our fertilizer use, to a tiny fraction of what we now need. And I went to a laboratory in Finland where they were producing a flour with a 65% protein content, and that you can turn into almost anything. I mean, it's very, very easy to turn it into different products, much easier than plant proteins are, and you tend to get a much better product out of the back of it than you get from plant proteins. I was the first person on Earth outside the laboratory to eat a pancake made from this bacterial flour, small flip for man. And it tasted just like a pancake. It really tasted just like a Western European pancake. But you can make almost anything from it. And the thing is with this approach is that you can scale it very rapidly and bring down the costs very quickly. And so all those substitutes for meat products and other animal products, which have been developed from plants, which are often quite expensive and have quite long ingredient lists, you can radically reduce the list of the ingredients and radically reduce the price until you can produce high protein foods, which are a lot cheaper than animal products, but also a lot healthier because they don't have to incorporate a lot of the bad stuff, which is in animal products, and they can be deliberately designed to incorporate good stuff instead. But if we were to do this, we could retire vast areas of the world from damaging forms of agriculture. And we could then restore rainforests and wetlands and savannas and mangroves and kelp forests and sea floors and all the other components of thriving Earth systems. And in doing so could not only stop the sixth great extinction, but also draw down much of the carbon dioxide we've already released into the atmosphere.
All right, George, lots of food for thought there and lots of thoughts on food production, I would say. Before I go, I should ask you a non-book question. You know, we have COP27 around the corner, and a lot of people are talking about the desperate methods being used by climate protesters, and you tweeted about this as well in their support. I'm referring to this incident where a can of tomato soup was hurled at a painting, a Van Gogh painting. So would you call it an act of vandalism, or would you call it as a desperate call to save the planet and therefore in need of our support?
Thank you. Well, of course, the painting is covered by a perspex shield, and the protesters knew that, so they knew they would do no actual damage to the painting. But yes, they're desperate. We're all desperate. Anyone who's understood what we're facing is desperate, because humanity has faced many horrors in the past, many horrendous horrors, and people in India and Pakistan will be well aware of some of those horrors, but those are nothing by comparison to what we face if planetary systems cross their critical thresholds and flip into a new equilibrium state, an equilibrium state that will be uninhabitable. Now, India and Pakistan have both experienced horrendous climate events this year. The massive heat wave, followed by those huge floods in the Indus Valley, absolutely devastating. But even then, just a foretaste of what will happen. I mean, these are just the flickerings before Earth systems collapse. But if they collapse, then there is no habitable space left on the planet. And the people of India in particular, where temperatures are likely to go way beyond the point at which human beings can be sustained, the disruption of weather systems will make growing food impossible. It will be among the first to experience that existential horror, which unprecedented levels of horror, for which history does not prepare us at all. And so anything which can draw attention to what we're facing and the urgent need to act, without itself doing damage or causing violence, that has got to be a good thing. And this is a classic example of political theatre using spectacle, actually harmless spectacle, because it didn't do any damage, to draw attention to a neglected issue.
All right, a harmless spectacle. George Monbiot, we've come nearly to the end of our conversation here. Thank you so much for speaking to us. All the very best with your new book. I hope the world devours it as well. And there is a rethink on the way we do farming today. We have a couple of audience questions, so we'll take those right now.
Thank you, Bahar. Thank you very much.
So can I read out some of the questions?
Please, yes.
George, so we have a question from Janmajay Mishra. In your book, he asks, you do not explicitly urge people to switch to veganism. Why not? If you think people can be convinced to start eating if you think people can be convinced to start eating fermented food as a protein source, why do you believe they cannot change their minds about veganism?
Thank you.
Well, look, what I was trying to say. Sorry.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, I would love everyone to switch to veganism. I'm a vegan myself, but I recognize that taking this missionary position isn't very effective. Trying to persuade people entirely through moral suasion doesn't get you very far. I wish it did. I wish that the world worked like I thought it worked when I was a young man, that you only have to lay out the information, give people the argument, and then they'll change their minds.
Pronto, it'll happen.
Bitter experience shows me it's not quite that simple. So yeah, that would be the ideal. That would be the ideal. But what we're seeing is a slow switch towards veganism, which I welcome, but it's not nearly fast enough, and a very rapid uptake of meat eating worldwide, in India and elsewhere, as you pointed out, and that's massively faster than the switch to veganism. So I feel that if we're going to have that decisive intervention, which puts us on a completely different trajectory, and actually getting out of animal farming is perhaps the most important environmental task of all, which is why I see precision fermentation as the most important environmental technology ever developed. If we're going to do that, we need to be able to give people products which are better and cheaper than the ones they're currently eating. And then I think what happens is we see the possibility of a techno-ethical shift, a bit like in Europe hundreds of years ago when the printing press was developed and parchment was replaced by paper. And suddenly the latent desire for change, political revolution, religious revolution, it was as if the lid had been lifted from that, and it just was able to explode outwards, and that change was able to happen very quickly. And it's when something becomes amendable that it becomes intolerable. So if we can show people there is a better way of having a really rich diet with lots of protein, with loads of fascinating, amazing products, and it's cheaper, and it's got a tiny fraction of the environmental impact and no animal welfare implications at all, then suddenly that's the point at which people say, oh, so why are we doing it the old way? And then you get this rolling and very rapid demand for change.
All right, we have another question from Maitri Kaushik. Dan Saladino, in his review of your book in Literary Review, said that while Solar Foods has claimed its bacteria-based protein is 100 times more efficient in converting energy to calories than animals, the highly respected International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems has said that there does not appear to be any publicly available data to substantiate this claim. What is your response?
Well, that's actually plain false. There's been there's several scientific papers that I refer to in the book, and there's over 1,000 references, mostly the scientific papers in the book, but there's several which specifically support those figures. And in fact, we're talking about a really massive shift away. So I found that review highly selective, cherry picking. I mean, he takes the exact opposite view to mine, and like many elite food commentators, so wants to keep this sort of system which looks beautiful but is highly dysfunctional. And I'm mounting a very grave challenge to that system. And unsurprisingly, many people have sought to misrepresent my book because it's very uncomfortable.
Strong words there from you. Another question, this is from Vismaya Reddy, and it makes a reference to the Indian writer Amitav Ghosh in his book, The Nutmeg's Curse, has argued that the contemporary dynamics of climate change stem from centuries-old Western colonial practices of deforestation, because cutting large number of trees was a means to control trade and ensure elevated prices. These were early examples of human greed and environmental destruction. So should not any solution to the farming crisis also place the burden proportionally on the Western nations?
Well, very much so. It was the Western nations which invented capitalism. You could trace it back, I think, to the island of Madeira in about 1420 when the Portuguese landed there, and soon afterwards discovered that it had great potential for sugar growing. And so they imported the three crucial commodities into that system. Well, they had the land there already, which it happened there were no people living there before the Portuguese arrived in Madeira. They brought in slaves, so they had labor brought in, and they brought in money from Flanders and Genoa. And so you had these three almost perfectly commodified resources: land, labor, and money, which Karl Polanyi describes as the sort of three crucial commodifications of capitalism. And it was the first time they were all brought together, and it instantly created environmental catastrophe. The sugar production peaked very quickly. Madeira became the biggest sugar producer in the world, and then it crashed. Within 20 years of the peak, it had fallen to 10% of what it was before, because they'd burnt through all the forests. Yes. The wood was required to refine the sugar, to boil the sugar and get the juice out of the cane. And so they then moved on to San Tome. They did the same there. They then moved on to the coast of Brazil. They did the same there. They moved on to the Caribbean. They did the same there. And capitalism is like this fire front which is raging across the world. And it's absolutely true that it was Western nations which started this. And in fact, we then, having moved into India with the East India Company and the force of arms that then made India part of the British Empire, we destroyed local enterprise and local subsistence and replaced it with this global capitalist tribute system, where according to Utsapat Naik, we extracted $45 trillion from India. And that's theft, that's looting. So he's absolutely right that, you know, the buck ultimately stops with us. But given where we are, we now need global change because we're so close to planetary tipping points.
Well said. I'm going to take now one last question, which is, from one writer to another. I'm curious to know about, how do you work on your nonfiction? This is from Charulata John. Do you wait till you finish all your research and interviews before you begin writing? How much do you edit? How much importance do you give to the writing itself, the style, the structure and tone?
Thank you. No, thanks very much. Well, I mean, I'm a great fan of fine writing, and I read a very large amount of fiction, a lot of novels. I've always got a novel or two going at one time. But the work I do tends to be very research heavy. So a great majority of the time is spent researching. And generally I'll take a chapter at a time. I'll research it intensely. And it'll take months to complete the research for one chapter. And then I try to condense all the material and make sense of it and structure the material. And only then do I do the writing. And the writing is, in terms of time, a very small part of the process, but obviously is the crucial part of the process. But what I try to do less than I used to is to structure the whole book from the beginning, because as the sort of process of discovery unfolds, then I find I do want to do things differently to how I might have envisaged at the beginning. And every day in researching this book, I discovered things which blew my mind, which I found quite extraordinary. And I kept asking myself, why doesn't everyone know this?
Yes.
And one of my hopes with the book is that a lot more people will.
And how many, you mentioned somewhere, how many thousands of scientific papers did you have to read just for this one book?
Yeah, no, I read over 5,000 scientific papers.
Right. So that's quite a record in itself. You read 5,000 scientific papers to write this book. So we've come to the end of this conversation. I've enjoyed it. I hope it leads to a food revolution of sorts to replace the green revolution, something which is gentler on the planet. Please do go and read this book. I think there are lots of interesting thoughts there. There are lots of ideas. It's not a book which is just about, oh my God, George offers some solutions there. People will find some of those solutions, uneasy. They may find them controversial, but I think it's important to address these questions of our times. George, thank you so much for speaking to me.
Thank you so much, Bahar. Really great to talk to you. And thank you everyone for listening. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Mr. Monbiot and Ms. Dutt, for that inspiring session. And of course, a huge thank you is due to you, our faithful and incredible audience, for joining us today online, and for all our partners that have made this festival possible. Our next session at 9 p.m. is Truth or Dare, the future of investigative journalism, where John Pilger is in conversation with Geeta Seshu. Remember to check out our website, tatalitlive.in, for the schedule and speakers, because we have many more exciting sessions lined up for you, both online today and tomorrow. And for those of you in and around Mumbai, remember you can join us for our exciting offline festival happening on ground on Friday, November 11th, Saturday, November 12th, and Sunday, November 13th. At the NCPA and at St. Paul's Institute and Tidal Waves Bookstore on Saturday and Sunday, featuring authors and ideologues such as Sanjay Baru, Arjun Gain, Aanchal Malhotra, Mamang De, Audrey McGee, and Shashi Tharoor, among so many other authors, journalists, poets, and ideologues, talking about everything from technology, the economy, to sports and food. Thank you for tuning in to Tata Literature Live 2022 in association with the NCPA, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Titan, powered by Godrej and Kotak. This session is sponsored by Kotak. The festival's social media handle is @Tata Lit Live across all networks, and that concludes our session for today. But continue logging on to Tata Literature Live 2022, where you can enjoy turning the page. Happy reading and good evening.